Good afternoon. So this morning we looked at a further presentation on sufferings that humans experience. And again, the purpose of looking at this topic over these last many weeks is that we need to reflect on suffering, coming to really recognize it, so that a deep aversion arises, leading us to seek out its causes. And in dependence on this deep aversion, when we recognize the causes of our suffering, we want to be freed of them, to gain a state freed of them. And thereby, we'll strive to cultivate the antidotes, the paths that are required to gain freedom from suffering. So this is what we continue to look at this morning. When one engages in this meditation, part of the purpose or the benefit of this meditation is when one is looking at the way suffering is presented, at the illustrations, one first looks at one's own lived experience. What have I experienced the sufferings presented, such as hunger and thirst, heat and cold, and so forth. And of course, one recognizes one has done so. Then one also, though, recognizes that the suffering experiences that I've encountered in this life are not unique to me. All other humans have experienced these. And when I compare myself to other humans, so many have these same suffering experiences, but greatly amplified, far worse than I have experienced them. And when I look beyond the experience of humans to non-humans, we see that humans suffer in ways that are similar to those in the various lower realms, but our suffering is greatly reduced compared to them. So when you're looking at it in this lens, it helps us to gain a more balanced, realistic approach or view of the sufferings that we do experience. And this we can utilize to recognize how actually fortunate we are. And we are in this incredibly fortunate position because of the causes we have accumulated. Those causes, though, have ripened, and when their potential is exhausted, those ripening results will come to an end. Therefore, it's imperative that I strive to accumulate similar causes again, or causes so that I experience similar results again. I do not want to suffer in the way that so many others in our world, as well as in the non-human worlds, are suffering. But not only must I strive to accumulate those causes, I know I can do so because I'm experiencing the results of having accumulated similar causes in the past. So this is a key recognition because it gives us a sense of confidence that I can do this. I can let go of what has no real value. I can let go of what causes harm, and I can rather focus on what has value and strive to accumulate the causes for happiness. So this is a skillful way to relate to the Dharma because it develops our confidence. It also helps us to see in a more realistic way just what we have achieved and thereby come to actually recognize more clearly our actual potential. So now we'll continue with where we concluded this morning and look at the suffering of demigods on page 164. The demigods, they find themselves situated between the worlds of humans in terms of their experience of happiness and suffering. They find themselves situated between the worlds of humans and those of gods. So the demigods, they experience a far greater comforts and happinesses than humans, but nothing compared to that of gods. So they find themselves in between the two. Of the realms of existence, they're divided into two, lower and higher realms. Higher realms can be divided into two, humans and all the gods together, or into three, humans, demigods, and gods. So you'll come across in text the divisions of the realms of samsara, usually into 6, but sometimes into 5. So the difference is not about the lower realms, that remains as 3, but whether the higher realms are presented as 2 or 3. So some will present it as 2, humans and gods. But Sangha, for example, he rather divided the god realms into gods and demigods. But where you come across a division, of a 5-fold division, demigods are included within or amongst gods. A teaching from the Buddha, recorded in the Sutra of Mindfulness, there the presentation for demigods is a bit different. So it will be the 5-fold division, but demigods are not included amongst gods, but some are included amongst spirits, and some are included amongst animals. So that's a less common, an uncommon presentation, but found in the Sutra of Mindfulness. The presentation in our text is the common presentation. So I just mentioned the other presentations, because one may come across them, and they are valid. What we have here is the most common presentation of the 6-fold division of realms. And then in that 6-fold division, the higher realms have 3, the humans, then demigods and gods. And demigods are situated explicitly between humans and gods. Lama Tsongkhapa writes, "It is said that the demigods are mentally tormented by jealousy that cannot bear the wealth of the gods. When based on that they fight with the gods, they experience many sufferings of having their bodies chopped up, split and the like. Although they possess intelligence, they have fully ripened obstructions and consequently cannot see the truth while in that body." So it is said that demigods are mentally tormented by jealousy that cannot bear the wealth of gods. So whilst demigods, their material situation greatly exceeds that of humans in terms of their wealth and luxury and so forth, and their sense pleasures, they can observe the gods, and they see that the gods have far superior wealth, luxury, and power, and particularly here the desire realm gods. And this leads to, just like amongst humans, jealousy arising. And just like amongst some humans, this jealousy then will be acted upon, and they act out in an unskillful way, an afflicted way. So we see that these beings, the demigods, still afflicted and act under the control of their afflictions. When, based on that, they fight with the gods. So under the influence of their afflictions, they engage in battle with the gods, where the gods are superior in terms of not just wealth and luxury, but also their power. So these battles do not go well for the demigods. They repeatedly are loose and experience the sufferings as described here. What we recognize here is that governed by the afflictions, these less powerful beings are engaging in conflict with powerful beings with a predictable result. They end up being chopped up and split and so forth. In other words, gravely wounded. Because of the strength of their afflictions, they keep engaging in battle like this, despite once again being harmed. So here we see some tie over with what we have in the other realms, where in that the beings act under the control of their afflictions. Those with power are easily able to dominate those without power. So we see this tie over here, and here the reflection is on the suffering that beings in samsara, such as these, the demigods, experience. Whilst the dominant, whilst the vast majority of demigods are overwhelmed by jealousy, their minds are dominated by jealousy and therefore conflict, this isn't all pervasive amongst all demigods. There are certainly those who are born there with extensive virtue. They can recognize that samsara has no abiding value, and they develop definite emergence, and they accumulate virtuous minds such as generosity, ethical restraint, and so forth. They can even generate bodhicitta. So so for some demigods, they utilize their excellent existence in a meaningful way, cultivating minds of Dharma. So here we see a clear parallel to the human realm, in that, just like in the human realm, beings are dominated by their afflictions, but nevertheless, some still recognize that samsara has no abiding value, and thereby strive to cultivate definite emergence, love, compassion, bodhicitta, and virtuous minds such as generosity, ethics, patience, and so forth. So too with the demigods. But the vast majority, just like with humans, follow their afflictions, dominated by their afflictions, follow their afflictions. In this final sentence, although they possess intelligence, they have fully ripened abstractions and consequently cannot see the truth while in that body. These beings, demigods, they, like humans, can come to recognize the faults of samsara, and thereby, through reflecting on suffering and coming to know suffering, and reflecting on the origins of suffering, giving rise to the determined attitude to abandon their afflictions, and give rise to a yearning to bring about a cessation of, or cultivate a cessation of suffering, they then strive in cultivating the various mental paths. So in this way, they can develop, through meditating on the Four Noble Truths, develop definite emergence. And from this, they can also, in the way described this morning, use this as the preliminary to meditate on love and compassion and generate bodhicitta. Whichever path they follow, whatever route they follow, they can newly generate either the Mahayana or the Theravada path of accumulation and develop that further into the path of preparation. So these demigods can practice and attain such a quality of realization. However, they cannot realize emptiness directly. They cannot progress to the path of seeing, just as far as the path of preparation. So that there is the meaning of the word truth, which would be seeing emptiness directly. And while in that body, usually that's translated as in that life, not body, body is literal. So in that life, as a demigod, they cannot realize emptiness directly. Now, on to the next, the suffering of gods. In the suffering of gods, we see that there are two gods themselves, not excluding demigods. Gods can be classed as two: the suffering of desire realm gods and the suffering of gods of the uppermost realm. What we've just looked at is the demigods. They are also part of desire realm gods. The desire realm gods have both demigods and full gods. And now we look specifically at the full gods of the desire realm, and thereafter at the gods of the uppermost realms. So looking at the suffering of desire realm gods, this has 3 points. Firstly, the suffering of dying, transmigrating, and falling. Secondly, the suffering of jealousy. Thirdly, and the sufferings of being chopped up, split, killed, and banished. So of the 3 types of suffering of desire realm gods, look at the first, the suffering of dying, transmigrating, and falling, which is itself divided into 2 subpoints, the suffering of dying and transmigrating, and then separately, the suffering of falling to a lower abode. So lower abode refers here to lower than a desire realm god. So the realm, including then humans as well as the lower realms. So looking at the suffering of dying and transmigrating. At the time of dying and transmigrating, when a god has seen the 5 signs of death, the suffering that springs from this is far greater than the happiness that previously arose from enjoying the delights of gods. After experiencing a long life that was filled with unimaginable delights, where gods having remarkable resources, all their sense pleasures are fully satiated over an extensive lifespan, when their death approaches, their suffering is immense. Recognizing just what has now come to an end, their suffering then is actually likened to that of a hell being in this final period of their life. To understand the suffering of their impending death, one needs to imagine living a life of complete joy and ecstasy, where one only experiences pleasures. Therefore, when one is approaching death, it's not that one's conditions are just getting worse, like it is for ourselves, but things they personally have never experienced are now happening for the very first time. So we're reading here, not reading on, there are 5 signs of death. For them now, as individuals, this is the first time something like this has ever happened to them over this extensive life. So firstly, their complexion changes, it becomes hideous. Secondly, their seats, or their home, what they abide in, this suddenly becomes uncomfortable. So they're experiencing discomfort, physical discomfort for the first time. Their body has become unpleasant to observe for the first time. And even their flower garments, their ornaments, these now wilt, and their clothes start to smell, and they sweat, things which they have never personally experienced before. So for us then really to appreciate what they are encountering, we need to be clear that they've only ever lived in a clean and comfortable environment without any blemish, in terms of their body too, without any blemish. All their possessions, everything has just been remarkable, beyond perfect. And now suddenly it is all changing. In relation to human experience, one can imagine someone who has wealth and status and prestige, and their children are well behaved and they have an excellent relationship with their partner. So really the idyllic life. And then suddenly it all goes wrong. Perhaps a grave natural calamity, or they are immediately have to flee the country, they become refugees, and they're now living in a filthy environment with no status, no possessions, nothing to protect them, surrounded by impoverishment and filth. Suddenly, it's all changed and it's all gone. So that is something similar. Or perhaps, having lived one's whole life here in this really comfortable, clean environment, and one, for whatever reason, is required to move to another country where things are still very undeveloped. And one is living somewhere where there's no plumbing, there's no running water, there's no electricity, and things are actually quite filthy. So for those local people there, for them, this is all they have ever known. But for ourselves, suddenly having to try and cope with such a situation, this would be really difficult. And the mind, of course, would get gravely unhappy from this. And certainly, this is how people in undeveloped parts of the world live. Certainly, the area I grew up in was like this. We had no electricity. When we wanted to warm up our home, the only way to do that is to light a fire. When you wanted to cook food, we cooked on that fire. So we'd have a stove, a wood stove, and that's what we'd use to heat our home and to cook. When you're making a wood fire, you put the wood inside, you light it, but then you need to blow on it to stimulate the fire. What happens? Because you're using a used hearth, you will get a whole lot of ash back in your face, and that will make your face dirty and will make your clothes dirty. And what you're going to do, other than cough, because you now also got a mouthful of smoke, you can go outside and wash your face in icy water. You're not going to wash your clothes because there's only icy cold water to wash. There's no washing machine. And anyway, when later in the day you make another fire, it's all going to happen again. So this is just normal life. You're dirty. You smell of smoke. Your skin is dark from ash, and your clothes are just dirty. That is how it is. That is normal existence. And if in your daily chores you cut yourself, and there's no medical treatment, there's no treatment to aid your healing or to deal with pain, you just make the most of it. And this for myself when I was young, and many people in our world, this is just normal existence. We didn't have dirt and filth to deal with, but for many in our world, that too is a common occurrence. I can think back to, now quite some decades ago, when the Kala Chakra was being offered in Bodh Gaya. So then the conditions were very poor. There really wasn't much, but there are a lot of people. So a lot of people, it means a lot of people going to the toilet. So, of course, there are just no toilets there. So they were cornered off a plot of land and cornered off in terms of put material around, so that would be designated, that field would be the toilet. So for us, coming from our monasteries were undeveloped then, our homes that we had grown up in were certainly not developed either. So we would going there to the toilet in the field wasn't particularly uncommon. It wasn't a big deal for us. But as the days went by, there wasn't so much unsoiled soil. And so this, for us, wasn't so nice, because this we weren't so used to, but nevertheless, it wasn't so far from what we were used to. But we looked at the foreigners and we thought, what were they making of this? Because you're walking through excrement to do your business on other people's business. And this could not have been pleasant for them. And we wondered, what were they making of this situation? Then what we see there is, for everyone, the situation was the same. But different people would experience that very differently. So there's something to be seen in that. And there's something both here and what we looked at this morning, how you experience the same thing very differently. It really adds to the suffering of dying for gods, is that whilst they themselves have never experienced this, any of these signs, these sufferings before, they have observed them when other gods die. So they know what's coming. Also, the other gods, seeing them, want nothing to do with them. They know that particular god is dying, and they abandon them in disgust. They're filthy. They stink. They want nothing to do with them. They do not associate with them in any way. So this dying god now, for this really protracted, lengthy period that they are approaching death, they have lost everything: the splendor of their body, the splendor of their home, their splendid friends. All desert them. Nothing is there to support them, and they are approaching death alone. So we can liken this to the early months of the pandemic, when people died in hospitals, also isolated and alone. Then the second suffering, the suffering of falling to a lower abode. In the same way, Letter to a Friend says, and just change the second and third line a little bit. As they transmigrate from the world of the gods, in the event that none of their virtue remains, they veer without control into the appropriate abode of animals, hungry ghosts, and beings of hell, all beings of hell. So looking at the whole verse, as they transmigrate from the world of the gods, in other words, as they are approaching death. So this is in this period in which death is approaching, in the event that none of their virtue remains. So what this refers to is that whilst they've been enjoying this long life of abundant pleasures, they will not have been accumulating virtue. They, blissed out in the ecstasy of their life. So they haven't been spending time accumulating virtue, but rather have been consuming virtue accumulated in lives previous to this. So when death comes, in the event that none of their virtue remains, they veer without control into the appropriate abode. In other words, they now lacking the virtue to be reborn as a god, they know where their next rebirth will be, because at the time in this death period, a clairvoyance arises for them, whereby they can see where they'll be born. They can see the rebirth that they will take. So they know whether they are going to be reborn as an animal, a hungry ghost, or the beings of hell, or as a human being. So they can see where they're going to be born and what those circumstances are. And compared to their life of luxury and pleasure and comfort, it's an immense suffering, no matter where they are going to be born. It is so much beneath what they have really ever known throughout the length of this life. And there's nothing they can do. It is too late. They have not created the capacity to accumulate virtue in this final period. They are under the control, like every sentient being in samsara is under the control of their karma at this point. Their karma is dictating their rebirth. They see their rebirth through their clairvoyance. And from this, they are mentally tormented by what awaits them. They can see what is before them. And they are desperate not to fall into that state, but they are helpless to prevent such a rebirth. So this is the situation for the vast majority of gods. But for some gods, they have take rebirth or attain rebirth in the god realms with sufficient imprints that they can utilize those imprints to accumulate virtue whilst gods. And here their situation in this regard is the same as that of some of the demigods, in that whilst abiding in the god realm with this body of a god and the delights of a god, they nevertheless have the imprints that they can reflect on the sufferings of samsara. And they can cultivate, through meditating on the Four Noble Truths, cultivate definite emergence and accumulate the causes for liberation, the minds of generosity, ethical restraint, and so forth. And they can attain a path of accumulation, path of preparation. And they can also meditate and cultivate love, compassion, and bodhicitta. So for some gods, this is their experience in gods, their experience as gods. They engage in cultivating the Dharma, and therefore their death experience is not like this, because as we see in the second line, in the event that none of their virtue remains, this is not the case for those gods who live a virtuous life in this way. And for such gods, their experience as they approach death will not be like those of the other gods. In other words, the 5 signs of death, they do not cause suffering at all. They do not cause suffering in the same way, nor do they have any need to fear their next rebirth. Whomever takes rebirth in any realm, but here we're talking about gods, does so in dependence on the causes accumulated in previous lives. So amongst them, those who attain rebirth in the god realms, all have attained rebirth there in dependence on extensive virtue. For some, whilst they are experiencing the ripening results of that extensive virtue, because of the imprints they've gained, they do not get overwhelmed by indulgence in the pleasures of this incredible rebirth, but they utilize their opportunity, their life, to continue their spiritual journey, continue to cultivate minds of the Dharma. And thereby, they can cultivate minds such as definite emergence, love, compassion, bodhicitta, and so forth, and thereby continue to accumulate extensive virtue. So when their death comes, the way they experience the signs of death are very different, and also their rebirth will not be in the lower realms. It will be either as a god or as a human. The meaning of this presentation then is that when it is to further deepen the understanding that we should not be drawn by what we find delightful, by the delights, the pleasures of samsara, but recognize that even if one has unimaginable pleasures, achieved everything imaginable in terms of pleasures, that lasting happiness still hasn't been attained. The situation is impermanent. It will come to an end. When the causes that ripened into such a result, when they start to fade and cease, that situation will end. And once again, one's karma will determine one's next rebirth. So this is the situation for all beings in samsara. And again, the meaning here is through this reflection to come to an ever more stable recognition, not to be drawn to wanting delightful outcomes, pleasurable outcomes, recognizing that even the greatest of existence remains flawed, and remains flawed for the same reason that our own lives are flawed, because of our karma being contaminated by the afflictions and our habituation to the afflictions. So we take this reflection then and use it to stimulate our determination to abandon afflictions, in particular, the root cause of all our suffering, the ignorance of self-grasping. In the same ways as described earlier, we take this recognition to develop a determined attitude, to accumulate virtue, to not come under the influence of the afflictions, and rather, through the accumulation of virtue and the abandonment of the afflictions, to strive for liberation, not to be distracted by pleasures and delights, but to remain focused on what is meaningful. So on the previous page we saw the suffering of desire realm gods, and there's the suffering of dying transmigrating, which we've looked at, and the suffering of the lower abodes, we've looked at both of those. Now we come to the second, the suffering of jealousy. For the gods with extensive heaps of merit, the most exquisite sense pleasures arise. When the offspring of the gods with little merit see that, they envy them and experience acute suffering and mental unhappiness. The term we have translated as jealousy should rather be translated as discouraged. So what it means then, so the suffering of discouragement is that the mind lacks confidence. One lacks a strength of mind. So that's quite different. The reading is just changing then this term envy in the third line. For the gods with extensive heaps of merit, the most exquisite sense pleasures arise. When the offspring of the gods, so maybe first talk about offspring. So this elsewhere will be translated as children. It's not the meaning. So the meaning is more just maybe not the same capacity, something like that. It doesn't mean like in the way the term is used in a family. It doesn't have that meaning, but not having perhaps the same capacity or prestige, this kind of thing. So lower in that sense. When the offspring of the gods with little merit see that they, instead of envy them, they see that, they become discouraged. They can discourage or lack confidence and experience acute suffering and mental unhappiness. So there's an analogy would be, if you think of a dog, and it's a very strong, brave dog, and it barks at whoever passes and is perhaps aggressive, until another more dominant dog passes. Then suddenly that same dog rolls over and shows its belly, and in this way it recognizes it doesn't have what it takes in relation to the other dog. So this is then likened to the offspring of the gods. So they do not have the power and the capacity that the regular gods have, the other gods, and therefore their mind is discouraged or dispirited. And that mental attitude is from the analogy of the dog, in that they have cowardice isn't a nice word, but really this lack of confidence, lack of strength of mind. So this is what should rather be, instead of envy or jealousy, should be this discouragement. So this term translated here as offspring, we have it in the Heart Sutra. There as children of the lineage. When the old translation, it was sons of the lineage. The meaning isn't that. It isn't children as in they have parents and they have uncles, but rather that they are newer in the lineage of bodhisattvas. So similarly here, in terms of gods, then these are maybe of lesser capacity than those with the most exquisite sense pleasures, so perhaps of lesser merit. So this is really the meaning of offspring here, or children in the Heart Sutra. So therefore, in the Tibetan language, this term children or sons, the same word, in the Dharma context does not usually mean that, but more of what I'm describing here or in the Heart Sutra. Perhaps, so in this context, it would be those of without extensive heaps of merit. So it would be a diminutive in that sense, not in the way that we normally think of children. Well, children are born from parents, they have siblings. This isn't the meaning. And that would also be the word offspring. So it doesn't mean this at all, because, for example, in this context here of gods, they aren't born from parents. They aren't born from the womb. Amongst the 4 types of rebirth, the rebirth is spontaneous. And when they are born fully formed. Not as children and then, not as infants and then toddlers and then children and then teenagers. This is not the case. They're born spontaneously, fully formed. So they don't go through this growth period. So therefore, understand that in these 2 contexts, here in terms of the God realms, as well as in the Heart Sutra, or perhaps in some other context, that when one sees a term translated as children or offspring or son, that the meaning is not necessarily that of in the normal family sense of the word. So it's good to understand this well. It's a bit off point here, but it helps give a greater clarity to some contentious points that come up when like this, because in the Tibetan language, the word boy and girl is used throughout most of one's life. So I'm sitting here, I'm a boy, I have parents. Now in English, I would not call myself a boy, it would sound a bit ridiculous. We'd say male, but that word male or female does not exist in Tibetan. They just say the same word for boy and girl. So as a translator, of course, you change the word. But from the Tibetan perspective, it's the same word. So whether you're little or you in between, or you're not quite an old person, but like a grandparent age, but all in between, you're just a boy and a girl. And so therefore, the usage of the term is really quite different. Hence, as the translator mentioned, there's no term male or female, which is what we would use in English. So the suffering here, to go back to the point, is this of discouragement, where one lacks confidence, a strength of mind. So this is the intense suffering that these gods without extensive heaps of merit have. The final suffering, so there are 3 sufferings for the suffering of desire on God, we had on the previous page in the middle. This is 3 points. This is the 3rd, the suffering of being chopped up, split, killed, and banished. So now, reading the first sentence. When the gods fight with the demigods, they experience the suffering of having the limbs and minor body parts, so fingers and toes, chopped off, and suffering of their bodies being split, and the suffering of being killed. It continues, if their heads are chopped off, they die. So this is the only way gods can die in battle, from having their head severed. Whereas there's severe injuries, such as having their limbs, and I think we'd say digits rather, cut off, these will spontaneously grow back. But the remaining limbs and, let's say, digits that are chopped off or split grow back and they survive. So the way they are killed is if their heads are severed. Final sentence, as for banishment, when there is conflict, the more powerful gods drive the weaker offspring of the gods out of their abodes. So here we see a similar expression of what happens in other realms, where those with power express that power, use that power in an abusive way to those who lack that power. So in this way, they are banished, or they are expelled from their homes. They lose their homes, they lose their abodes. No one imagines that there's a god who, for them, this is their abode. Another god who's more powerful decides they want to expand their area. They come, they have battle, and the god that loses gets expelled. And they flee, leaving everything behind, because they've engaged in violent battle. The battle is lost, and they leave with their life, but nothing else. Everything is left behind, and now they need to find somewhere else that is empty, that they can live, because they're going there weak and wounded, and now they need to find somewhere that has no resident god to try and find a home again. The very purpose of the Buddha having taught this, Lama Tsongkhapa having included it in his presentation, and us spending time discussing it here, and you then including it in your meditation, is to strengthen the minds that we have been developing over the course of this year, which is to recognize that wherever one finds oneself within samsara, one is subject to suffering. So here in particular, in the context of the desire realm gods, the two outcomes to strive for, the outcomes to strive for, is to recognize that wherever one is in the desire realm, no matter how marvelous one's existence is, the afflictions remain, and therefore one suffers. And not only does one suffer, one creates the causes for further suffering, and through the expression of one's afflictions, one brings unhappiness into the lives of others. The purpose of this reflection is to get us to truly recognize there's nothing worth striving for that is to be found in cyclic existence that has any abiding essence. Even if we have the most abundance of excellences, we will still suffer because of the presence of the afflictions. So therefore, I need to let go of the afflictions. Because wherever they arise and the direction they push me in towards what attracts me or away from what repulses me, those afflictions are deceptive. I need to abandon them. That's the first major recognition. The faults of samsara coming from these afflictions. And the way that I abandon them, the second major recognition, is through cultivating virtue, which means cultivating the virtuous ways of thinking. So in terms of generosity, wanting to give of myself, recognize truly in a balanced way what I have in abundance and helping those in need. And in terms of ethics, all expressions of harm, whether it's through ways of speaking, ways of acting, ways of thinking, these need to be restrained. I need to ensure, to the best of my abilities, I don't act under the influence of afflictions, guard my mind from criticizing and complaining, but rather recognize the good in others, the kindness in others, and thereby, with this mind of ethics, can express my generosity more sincerely. So too with patience. Through cultivating qualities such as generosity, wanting to bring good into the lives of others, ethics, not wanting to harm others, that aids the cultivation of patience, whereby one doesn't become disturbed in the face of adversity. One does not want to bring harm to others, but bring good to them. And we cultivate joyous perseverance, delight in virtue, recognizing our endeavors, taking delight in what we are doing. And to the extent we can, we try and concentrate our mind, and try to meditate, do these analytical meditations, bring our mind back from distraction to the topic of reflection. And if we have the training, engage in the cultivation of understanding reality. So in this way, we cultivate the causes that will lead us for freedom. And we generate an ever stronger determined attitude. I will gain freedom. The causes for freedom that I can develop, now I will. Those that I don't yet have the knowledge or skill in, I make aspiration that I meet those teachings and I can cultivate them. So these are the two parts. The one is developing a disenchantment and a revulsion for samsara, and the second is the outcome of that is the striving in virtue, the positive mind. And this is what we need to come to in our meditations. And this is how we can include the reflections on the God realms in these meditations. Sorry, it's a bit over time, but I just want to make this final point. And because of this topic, it's important to make the statement again and again. All of us are the same in wanting happiness and be freed of suffering. So we have this natural aversion for suffering and wish for happiness. Therefore, this topic of suffering tends not to be anyone's favorite. We do not even want to think about suffering. But in your own daily life, you know when you have problems, you need to look at that problem so as to identify its cause and come up with solutions. And that is what this is about. We need to recognize, come to know suffering, so that we have the determined attitude to recognize its causes And this is important so that we don't just merely know it's the afflictions, but when we recognize attachment drawing us to something and we want it, we recognize by pursuing that we are strengthening our attachment. Likewise with aversion, by following our aversion and expressing it, we may feel justified, but we are actually strengthening our causes for suffering. So by reflecting well on suffering, one will come to develop a revulsion for the afflictions themselves. And this is crucial, to have the strength of mind, or the self-discipline, not to follow the afflictions. So from knowledge, freedom will follow. Without knowledge, freedom cannot come. So I encourage you to do these meditations, and finally to make the point, to do them in a skillful way, where in each meditation session you spend time looking at suffering, but you ensure that the meditation concludes with the mind being powerful and positive by recognizing the need to cultivate the path, and therefore in the meditation cultivate virtuous minds of love, compassion, or patience, or generosity, so as to conclude the meditation with a virtuous mind, a positive mind, rather than a mind being pushed in a negative direction by reflecting just on suffering. Then thank you. We can conclude therefore this week. And I think again, we meet again in 3 weeks' time. Thank you.